If I had my career to live over again, I would amp up positive feedback eightfold. And the
Love that.
reason was I thought my A and B players knew they were A and B players. I didn't have to give them positive feedback. And nothing could be farther from.
Interesting. Yeah. Welcome back to Stepwise, a series of deep conversations with inspiring leaders about who they are, how they see the world, and their journeys that have influenced their values. Mike Mears, former head of human capital for the CIA, has a rich and storied lifetime of experiences, stories, and lessons for us. His experience came initially in the military, following his training at West Point, where he was a U.S. Army combat platoon leader, for which he was decorated for valor, a general's aide, and later served as commander of a nuclear missile site. Later, in industry and the government sectors, he played a role in the formative days of leader development at General Electric in Crotonville under Jack Welch. And even later, he founded and led the CIA Leadership Academy. He's also launched multiple small business startups and served as president of a fast food company. So, West Point, Harvard MBA, distinguished military career, private sector, and GE, and the CIA. Did I also mention he's a published author with his latest book, published by Fast Company Press in January, called Certainty: How Great Bosses Can Change Minds and Drive Innovations, which was published in January. Today, Mike trains and consults on advanced leadership and management approaches for government sectors and private as well. In this interview with Mike Mears, you'll learn about his science-based approaches to leading and teaching leaders, his background at General Electric in leader development in the Jack Welch era, background on his new book, Certainty, the best boss he worked for, Secretary of Commerce Malcolm Baldrige, and what Baldrige did to earn that title, the impact of the best bosses, he calls them one percenters, and much more. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Mike Mears. So I'll simply say, Mike Mears, pleasure to meet you. I so appreciate you coming and doing this with me today.
Absolutely. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having an old spy on your show.
If you wouldn't mind, you have such a wonderful, rich life experience, and I'd love you to kind of introduce yourself to our listeners, and let's talk a bit about the book.
Fantastic. Sounds good. Yeah. One thing I was blessed by, I mentioned to you earlier, was is a long time. I'm up there in years, so I've spent decades on leadership. And luckily in my career, I had a very varied career where I was in the military during the Vietnam era and combat. That's like dog years of learning leadership, seven years in one. And then went to grad school in business and got out and just did small business startups and so on. So small business is a good way to rapidly learn leadership too. Then all throughout the 90s, I worked for Jack Welch, and that was when GE was at its peak, right? So his style wouldn't work today, but I learned so much about how can you create a culture that's really like small business. And then, of course, years and years with CIA, I retired there as chief human capital. But that gave me a view of government. And so when I boil all these experiences down, what I come up with basically is it's all about human nature. Our intrinsic desires are the same and so on. And so one trick of leadership, though, is to understand where they're different. But that's not what I specialize in. I just go for what makes people tick and what's that mean for leadership.
I've been known to define leadership as building capacity of self and others to create breakthrough results.
I like yours. Yeah, I like yours better than mine. Mine is kind of mine. I'm thinking more of others, right? I'm not thinking about myself, so I didn't include that portion. So for me, it's how do you awaken basically all of the brains of all the people that work for you? And when I say that, I mean, how do you go from people frozen in status quo to inspiring them and so on? What goes on in the human mind to get there? And here's a little story, interesting story. But when I worked for Welch, and I don't know if this story is true, but It's apocryphal
The
anyway.
best really are not.
Right? So uh, back in that day, the unions and the big companies like GE were at odds all the time. So there was a dinner for a retirement dinner for the union chief, and everybody behaved themselves and went beautifully. And then right at the end, the union chief got up after he literally got his gold watch, like the old days. And he stood up and he gave a talk, and it was impassioned about how much he loved GE and how much he loved the people there, what they meant to him, and how much he had learned. And then finally, right at the end, he pauses and he looks at Welch and he says, "And you know, Mr. Welch, for 34 years, you've had use of my hands." He said, "If only you'd asked, you could have had my brain as well." Isn't that something? And
Wow.
I start with uh, using a little bit of science, and basic human instinct is survival. And what does that do? Well, that locks us into clinging to the status quo. We see it in others, we don't see it in ourselves. So, but then you get to from A to B, where you get really excited people in the workplace. They're firing on all cylinders. They love driving into work. And so the what's in between is the magic that I love to study and think about.
Excellent. Yeah, I refer to that often as kind of engaging at head, heart, hands, and spirit levels, meaning, you know, the union leader, you got my hands, you didn't get my brain, you didn't necessarily get my heart. And we were not necessarily aligned to the why, like, what's the higher calling? I'm building a cathedral as opposed to just laying bricks. And
I like that a lot.
fabulous.
My breakthrough, one of my breakthroughs was I remember there was a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. He was
Oh, sure,
a
sure, sure, sure.
yeah, he was an economist. He made a simple model of you've got your basically what you would think of or we would think of as the logical brain, the calculating or concentrating is probably a better word when we concentrate or focus. And then the rest of the brain, he called it the automatic brain. Now, what's interesting about that, that's everything you said. And I think we tend to overlook the complexity of that because that's got all the emotions in there. It's got all the cognitive biases in there. It's got habitual behavior in there, and this stuff makes a huge difference to leaders. And so leaders sort of have to go into that auto brain or the way you described it. Uh, Otherwise, you don't reach them on logic. I've never seen it. It's like the vision statement on the wall. Nobody responds to that.
Well, Mike, you're still very involved in educating leaders. And yet today, I haven't been in the industry quite as long as you have, but I've been at it 45 years. And I've not seen five generations like we have in today's workplace. These multi generations have different needs, have different styles, approaches, life circumstance, the things that have imprinted upon them as important. I think about, kind of generations entering workplace now who, were born in 2000 and, they heard of 9/11, but that's ancient history to them. But they do know about 2008 financial crisis, and they do know about SARS and COVID and, geopolitics, and they know all about that kind of stuff. And they have a very different viewpoint than those of us that were, my parents were Depression era folks, and I had a certain imprinted set of values about responsibility and care for others and stuff like that. What are you finding as some of the differences in how you are having to educate leaders today because of maybe those differences or others?
What I specialize in are both ends of the management chain, the executives, and then at the bottom, those frontline managers are incredibly powerful force because they're face to face every day. They don't know it. They
Yeah.
they feel completely stymied,
Well,
right?
that's well said. Yeah.
But they are. If you could capture all the frontline managers in an organization and just have them behave in certain ways, you could change the world.
Well, let me tell you a quick story and what started me on this latest book project. I live in Bozeman, Montana. I was at a dinner party with people the age of my wife and I. And this one individual, very prominent surgeon, was complaining bitterly about people that worked for him and said something like, I've got this really incredibly gifted PA who came to me the other day and wanted to take Thursday afternoon at 4 o'clock off to watch her kids' soccer game. Boy, we never did that when I went through medical school. And,
Boy,
we had to put in our 100+ hours a week. And God, they're just not committed. And I said, hmm, that's really interesting. Is this person otherwise very talented? Oh, yeah, couldn't afford to lose her. Oh, and he was going on and on. And I said, how about this? The kids use a phrase these days that they say, and they're not wrong. How about if she's not wrong? How about what would it make possible if you would think about different ways to connect with her as opposed to judging her by the standards of a different era?
yeah,
Does she have
exactly.
stuff that she could contribute if you could just listen differently to her? She's not less committed. She just wants to go watch her kids' soccer match, right? All that kind of stuff. And so I started thinking about that and paying attention to the number of conversations I was having in multi-generation ways with people complaining about those people or those people, as opposed to saying, what do we need to do if we could honor each other's values? Listen one beat longer, ask one more question. What would that make possible in terms of harnessing the best of that generation or the best of that individual? Because that's where we are. We're not going back to.
No, we're not going back. Absolutely. And that's funny. I've listened to that all my life because when I first entered, this it was my way or the highway.
Yes.
Um, but it's the fascinating thing to me. One of my favorite writers goes way back. He was an MIT professor in the 1950s. He wrote a book called "The Human Side of Enterprise," and it was
Doug McGregor.
yeah. And he came up with this theory X, theory Y, which was taught
Yep.
in colleges in the
Yep.
60s. Um, and all it is exactly the same crossroads we're sitting at today with that guy's thinking of, they're not toeing the line like we used to. And then there's theory X, which is what you said, which is, start asking those questions and give more positive feedback and start reflecting and do active listening. And it, as I've gone through my journey and kind of what I did was throw out everything I knew about leadership and start all over and just start with human nature. What is it? What makes us tick? Because spies have to do that. That's part of being a spy. You really have to understand human nature. So start with that, and then work forward to use a little science, figure out how does the mind work and not work, basically. And we are more irrational than rational. That's what Kahneman said, and that's what you just mentioned. With the gut, the heart, and so forth. So once you understand all that, and then you can find three things. One pattern of stuff that you're doing already as a leader, just do more of it. It's proven. The second one is stop doing. So there's a group of things you should stop doing, and the third category is some kind of new approaches that I've been working on that people can use going forward. But on that, keep doing. It's those basics that you just hit, which is question asking and active listening. If I had my career to live over again, I would amp up positive feedback eightfold. And the
Love that.
reason was I thought my A and B players knew they were A and B players. I didn't have to give them positive feedback. And nothing could be farther from the truth.
Interesting. Yeah.
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 And Gallup's doing some interesting work on this, and I'm trying to sniff around the edges. And I think uh, if you gave every employee one little tidbit of positive feedback, this is one on one, not in a group, but one on one, every week, you could get those engagement rates that Gallup measures and others do. You could just make huge increases in that. And the reason is that we sort of think, my theory is a bit of positive feedback takes away uncertainty in the brain, which is the enemy of leadership. and it seems to decay over time, but it lasts maybe a week. And that's why I say this weekly cycle. Yeah, and if you look at the Gallup numbers, and this is true, I tell executives, look, put out a poll quarterly, bi-monthly, ask three questions, and one of them is my boss has given me positive feedback in the last week or month or whatever, and the results are still appalling. You got always less than 25% of the workforce has not had positive. Now, how hard is that? Foster, I mean, really, what's it take? 5, 6 seconds to, because everybody's done something positive. And if you don't know what they've done, that gives you a great chance for a discussion. You say, what are you proudest of this week? And then you're going to find out what they did. And then you praise them. So some of this stuff gets down to that molecular atomic level. Uh,
I would say it's not hard to give the positive feedback. For many leaders, the hard part is listening, is paying attention to those kinds of things. I'm going to take it one step further, and I'd love to have you react to this because you come out of military and with your CIA background, I would assume that that attracts a different type and style of leader or somebody that's comfortable in that environment than maybe a corporate environment. I'd love to test that with you. But my theory is one step before the feedback piece. I think we would transform American business if everybody working in an organization knew the 3 to 5 things that were most critical to the success of that job and knew what an A looked like for each of those characteristics. We don't even hit on those cylinders.
no, and isn't that amazing? Because all of the really solid scientific research on motivation. Um, a huge one is a sense of purpose.
Yep.
Another one is meaningful work.
Yep.
And so if you haven't done what you said and come up with these 4 or 5 things, how does that poor worker down in the bowels of the organization know that that what they're doing makes a difference? And because we all want that connection.
When I make that statement to C-suite executives, and I do it all the time, they are aghast, like, "Oh my God, that's so simple." Yeah, well, how well do you do it?
Exactly.
Mike, these are the 3 things I'm looking for in your job, and this is what an A looks like for each of them. Let me know how I can support you. I'll give you feedback on how well it's going from my point of view, and we'll have a conversation.
I truly believe there's a basic cognitive bias that's unnamed yet, but we tend to go for the hard solutions as opposed to the soft solutions. So I'll give you an example. When we choose leaders, I see this everywhere. Everybody says, yeah, we pick our frontline managers for their technical skills as well as their people skills. Well, that sounds good, except I've done studies on this, and when you grind it down, what happens is the people skills go out the door in importance, and especially you see this especially in mission-driven organizations and U.S. Marshals or CIA or places like that. And so, what do you get? It's like the old saw: if you pick your best salesperson to be head of sales, and what do you get? Well, you get a mediocre sales director, and you've lost your best salesperson.
Right, right,
So,
right, right.
so I really believe that there is this bias, and where we really see it on a big level, I think, is the tendency for executives to reach for the reorganization level to solve cultural problems. Uh, I have not seen this work yet.
Yeah, structures are seldom the solution, and that's generally the
Yeah,
first thing that's applied. We're going to reorganize. We're going to put a new system in. And I will always say, kind of, leaders establish culture, systems merely reinforce it. So, if we run away from that soft stuff, we've missed a great deal. Hey, Mike, what was the impetus behind you writing your current book? And I'd love you to spend a little time talking about the book and what you cover and stuff. But what had you write it?
somebody asked me a question that I found so troubling and actually a little embarrassing 20 years ago. that it completely knocked me off the rails, and I've thought about that question ever since. So here's the story. Sounds like a bad spy novel the way it starts. With my phone
Hey, you're
rings.
entitled. You're
Yeah, my
entitled.
phone rings in CIA, and it's from the executive assistant of the deputy director of operations, which is that's the person who's the spy master. They control all operations worldwide. They know all the secrets. That's the big Magilla man or woman sits in that position. So I get this call. It says, "Come right up. The DDO wants to see you immediately." So I get that little pang of fear, when you get that call from.
I can't understand why.
And so I did the old, "Can you tell me is what the subject is? Try to ferret out. Am I getting fired, or is this something?" And she said, "No, just he said it was important. Get up here right away." So I go rushing in, and he looked up and he just said, asked me the question: "Is Mike? Why is it when I pull the levers, nothing happens?" And I knew by levers he meant, those old traditional reward systems, metric
Yeah.
systems, all that training system, all that stuff. Here's where it gets bad. I was his, what was the title? Chief Counselor for Leadership and Management,
Okay.
which was unheard of. This is, back in '99. That was an
Wow.
unheard of
Wow.
position. And so I was the guy who knows everything. My whole life had been spent in those areas, and I couldn't answer the question. That's what I started working on. And so it's been fascinating because I teamed up with scientists and neuroscientists to work on it. Okay, what is it about? It took me like 5 years to figure out the answer is human nature. That's why the levers don't work. But then you got to reverse engineer human nature to say why, right? And when you do that, and working with a scientist, you find out that yes, we are. We've got these survival instinct is there is huge, but it's unconscious. Just because we haven't been chased by a bear today doesn't mean it's not there all the time. And then you got the basic human drives. One of my profs was the world's expert on human drives, and they came up with bonding, acquiring, learning, developing, um, or defending is the fourth. And the guy's name was Paul Lawrence. He wrote a book called Driven, and so he told me one time when we were working together. He said, "Mike, don't forget that bonding is first among equal. We are social animals. So when you start thinking of people that way, that means that I'm very concerned what my boss thinks of me. I don't want to look silly in front of my boss. I want to bond with my colleagues. However, I do want to protect my autonomy. You got this pull and tug in leadership. But when you start following that thread, you can use that little simple model. You can really uncover some fascinating things about leadership."
Fantastic. Your book is called Certainty: How Great Bosses Can Change Minds and Drive Innovation. It is due out January 28th, as
28th.
I recall. Yeah.
Yeah,
Excellent. Best of luck on the launch. And
absolutely.
and for people listening in, it's available on Amazon and
They can order through the bookstore or any of
okay.
the online. Yeah.
Excellent. And
So
we'll put a link in show notes on this interview for that. Here's my working thesis on this one. You can't have done the educational work for others your for the entirety of your life without you being changed yourself. That's my thesis. How have you been changed? If you were available at GE and Crotonville and workouts and experienced that, you ran the CIA Leadership Academy. How have you been changed by some of these educational experiences that you've either been part of or designed and delivered?
well, when I was 50 years old, I had a woman come up to me and say, you ought to tell more stories. And she was one of the women who had broken the glass ceiling at CIA. This was, gosh, 20 years ago. Um, and it dawned on me that my view of the brain is that facts will convince. I was not you. I'd never told a story in my life. So when I was 50 years old, I spent 2 years rerunning the tapes in my mind to find stories in my background. And you talking about an interesting reflection um, exercise, that is truly, and remember, you can't be the hero of a story. So it's usually how you got bruised or a lesson learned. And another one was I was walking at CIA 10 years ago near the first floor where you see the famous seal. And I saw another fellow who'd worked for me, Mark, coming across the way. And I said, "Hey, Mark, how are you? I haven't seen you in years." And he brightened up and he said, "I'm great." He said, I just got my certificate from Georgetown to be a coach. And I smiled and I said, "Oh, Mark, I'm so happy for you. I knew, I know you had a lifelong interest in that." And then he had this puzzled look on his face. And I said, "Mark, what's wrong? What?" And he said, "Oh, well, I thought you hated coaching." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, 15 years ago, I came to your office and I told you that I wanted to enroll in some coaching classes, and you grimaced."
Wow.
Stop the story right there. So,
Wow.
yeah, what I going back in my head thinking, gosh, I remember he was interested. And I remember he was in the executive training department, which was behind schedule. Uh, and maybe I was thinking, oh gosh, if he's off training, we're going to fall farther behind. Um, and that was the meeting to me. In his mind, the perception is totally different because this was my lesson: is that we all have different narratives for the same things we see. His narrative was, "Hey, look, my boss burst my dream. He popped the bubble, uh, and has knocked me off course, and it doesn't like coaching and probably doesn't like me."
And it was
So
nothing you said directly.
wow. So yeah, this was from a facial expression, and I stumbled into this by accident. So how many people have you, I, and any of the listeners been involved with, and they've misinterpreted our quote narrative? So the big lesson there is what? Get feedback. Get feedback. And listen actively when you're getting the feedback to find out if you're on the same wavelength with these people. But anyway, there's 1,000 of those things that have my life to live over again. Foster, I would behave very differently starting with that, giving more positive feedback.
Well, and I hope these stories are in the book, or
Some of them
some
are,
of
yeah,
them are. Yeah.
absolutely, yeah.
I fortunately didn't have that same bias. I grew up the son of a storyteller for whom the mantra was another story ruined by an eyeball witness. So I was never encumbered by fact or
You're a lucky man, see,
I'll
because
tell
I
you what.
was.
Yeah, I do appreciate the fact that it's not necessarily what happens; it's what we make mean of what we make mean of that which happens that sticks with us and matters to your story. You might have had a bad lunch, and he held that for 15 years.
He held that for 15 years. So
Yep.
it's a good example of, we see behavior by vision. The brain can't stand uncertainty. It's got to make up a story.
Yep.
We're unconscious of it, but it makes up a story of why that occurred. And so the big lesson is they're always watching you
Yeah.
24/7.
Oh boy. Yep.
Two, they can take a negative view of any behavior. So, Mr. or Mrs. Leader, you better start making sure you have more one-on-ones with people and get light feedback from yourself. Find out where they are. Otherwise, you can go right off the track. It's just because that's the way the human mind works.
I think one of the most important non-negotiables for leaders today, and this is one of the prompts for me wanting to write my book, is that different definition of reality. Reality isn't that those 4 seconds and making stuff up about it. It is finding out what the reality is. You know, Mike, you had your head down and you walked across, describe the behavior. Like, what's up with you? Now let's get to reality. And if leaders can't understand the difference between perception, judgment, and this reality, then they're lost. I mean, that's a non-starter.
Absolutely. And executives can really go off the rail because they can do more damage, that they'll have a perception some change is needed that they've heard anecdotally when that, you know, maybe you just need to create a more vibrant culture is the real answer here, not the fact that you need to close down Division B or merge it with Division C.
Well, I love what you've done basing your leadership comments on science.
You know what it does for me? It gives me the why. I never listen to people say, you know, give more feedback. But now I know why from the way the mind functions that it's imperative to do it. So that's what helps me. Two guys back well after 9/11, two neuroscientists got together and they were talking about um, aha moments in the mind. And current thinking was that it's very rapid analytical thinking. You know, my prefrontal cortex is somehow speeds up, and they wanted to know why. What's really going on there? So I linked up with John Cunhos, and what these guys found still stuns me. It sounds magical. Is that first off, the insight mechanism is not in the prefrontal cortex. It's just above your right ear, a little spot smaller than a dime. Um, that literally it flashes. There's a flash of energy that occurs, and this is where it starts to get a little strange. Instantaneously, new neuron connections are made. Uh, and so as I was talking to Cunhos, I said, well, what about brain chemicals? Have you guys looked at that side of things? So he says, yeah, you know, he said there's about 30 chemicals that slosh around in your brain. And the instant an insight occurs, they combine in a certain way that does two things. One is it gives you a pleasurable sensation. And, you know, it's like you doing your Sudoku, your crossword.
Oh yeah,
Ah,
yeah,
it feels.
yeah.
But here's the second thing. And they said, and this group of chemicals combined gives you a complete sense of certainty. So what that means is
Interesting.
we're erasing all of that change resistance through this. So I still marvel at this whole the whole thing. And so what I've done is working with some organizations that I consult with is simply getting them to use what I call insight prompt. I'm walking down the hall with a CIA director. I won't say which one. And he turns to me and he says, Mike, why is it they're not being more creative? And I knew he was talking about the employees because that was his big thing is and then he paused and he looked at me and said, I've told them in my first 5 talks I wanted more innovation. So how do you know, that's both a naive question and a cosmic question at the same time. Okay, so that's one. So the second story is when Leon Panetta was CIA director, we'd have a Bin Laden meeting every Wednesday, and very elusive because he had completely off the grid and no connections with any people. So Panetta's in the 5 o'clock meeting, and he turns to this one hapless fellow, and he says to him, he said, "So what what new ideas have you got to catch Bin Laden?" And the guy, you know, raises his hands up and says, "Chief, I don't know." Says, "I'm out of ideas. We're all out of ideas." So Panetta flares up, but then does what leaders should do, good leaders. He apologizes immediately and says, "Wait, I just want you to know I'm not mad at you. It's just the situation." And he said, "Let's do this. We're going to adjourn this meeting, and you come back for next week's Wednesday session and bring me 10 new ideas to catch Bin Laden." And everybody nodded, and they went off on their way. So what happened? A week later, they come back in. They have 37 new ideas. And the reason is, without knowing he was doing it, he prompted them with using accountability of the next meeting in front of the director, but he prompted them to reflect, which is the key to getting to an aha moment. Right.
And it's okay not to be perfect in that. Just come up with a bunch of ideas. I'm looking at number, not necessarily quality.
Yeah.
Just want a bunch of ideas. Fabulous. So this is a perfect question to follow that up, Mike. What gives you hope for the future?
So, what gives me hope about the future would be if we can up our cadre of leaders, if we can improve, people who are existing leadership positions, we can select better for people, and that means again, really do select for those people skills, not just give lip service to them, and it also means upping the validity of that by using structured interviews or really brief psych assessments or something. Make sure you're getting what you think you're getting. But if we keep pushing and on the leadership front, that's what gives me hope, because we're going to get more and more out of human nature. We're going to get more out of what's buried in there, and we know people are capable of doing great things. So let's let them accomplish great things.
Brilliant. Yeah, one of my favorite leaders. I've been coaching of my last 45 years, I've been probably coaching for 30 of that. And I keep stories of my the favorite leaders I've worked with. And this one was right up there. And she said, a great leader is a definer of reality, that certainty piece, and a purveyor of hope.
Interesting.
And that's what a leader does.
Wow.
And I
I
thought
love
that's
that.
just brilliant, just genius.
I call those people one percenters. Best boss I ever worked for was Secretary of Commerce way back when, Mac Baldrige. The Baldrige Award is named after this. He was so deeply loved. He would walk into the cafeteria, he would grab them and grab about 8 of them and say, "Come on, come on in and sit down with me and let's have lunch together." And they would have lunch and it was chit chat, but he would sit down and he'd always slip in one question, which was, "Hey, if you were me, what one thing would you change here?" Uh, a soft way to get feedback on both himself and the organization. But when you work for people like that, those one percenters, it's like breathing pure oxygen. Oh my God, it's just you feel like you're Superman or Superwoman. You could accomplish anything.
Creating capacity and self and others to create breakthrough results. That's what great
There
leaders do.
you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
So, again, Mike's new book is Certainty: How Great Bosses Can Change Minds and Drive Innovation. You've given us a quick peek into some of the background behind that book. I wish you great success in its launch. We'll do whatever we can to support you here, and just really appreciate your time, Mike.
Foster, thank you so much. I love chatting with you, and I love your podcast.
Set the table, invite cool people, magic happens. Mike Mears, spy, business leader, leadership scientist, incredibly cool person. As a fellow lifelong learner and practitioner of leadership, I learned a ton from the conversation with Mike. How he begins at the start of what makes people tick, the importance of positive feedback, and how we are biased to hard versus soft solutions to complex issues when that may not serve. I'm grateful to Mike for his time with me and for sharing his journey on Stepwise. And don't forget to check out Mike's latest book, Certainty: How Great Bosses Can Change Minds and Drive Innovation. An important read for today's times, available on Amazon. Until next time, Stepwise.
Thank you for listening to Stepwise. Stepwise is brought to you by Dr. Foster Mobley. Edited and promoted by Zetis. You can listen to more episodes wherever you stream podcasts. Find out more at fostermobleymt.com or follow us on social media at Foster Mobley. That's FOSTERMOBLEY. We look forward to having an inspiring conversation with you soon.